Hello and welcome to the Klassiki Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your one-stop shop for the wide world of cinema from Eastern Europe. Subscribers gain access to our library of classic and contemporary films, as well as filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, and more. You can sign up for a 7-day free trial today at klassiki.online. The anniversaries continue here on the Klassiki Podcast. Last week we were reconsidering Sergei Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible 80 years after its release. And this week we're celebrating a centenary, 100 years since the birth of the great Sergei Parajanov. An Armenian born in Georgia who found his artistic calling in Ukraine, Parajanov turned Soviet cinema on its head in masterpieces like Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors and The Color of Pomegranates, earning admirers around the world. But his experimental approach to the folk cultures of Ukraine and the Caucasus and his queer identity proved problematic, and he spent time in and out of labour camps, unable to realise his artistic vision. A century after his birth, his work still provokes vital questions about post-Soviet national identity and self-determination. So, what does Parajanov mean today? To answer this question, I spoke with Carmen Gray, a critic and programmer who has specialised in the cinema of Eastern Europe and the Caucasus, and who has been thinking and writing about Parajanov for years. You can read more of Carmen's work and watch a selection of Parajanov's films on Klassiki by following the links in the show description. Carmen Gray, thanks for joining us to talk all things Parajanov.
Thank you for having me.
So when I decided to record an episode about Parajanov, my thoughts went straight to you because I know he's someone that you've thought about, written about a lot over the years. So let's just start off maybe with some slightly hackneyed questions, but just to kind of set the scene. What does Parajanov mean for you? And I guess also what did he mean for Soviet cinema at the time, and maybe what does he mean now? So there's a trifecta of questions there to start us off with.
Sure. I mean, I think he's not only one of the masters of the region. I mean, I'm really into Eastern European cinema and cinema from the Caucasus, but he's, one of the greats, full stop, I think. Not only for his craft. So, there's this real originality and poetry of his filmmaking, which is really unique. But also as a figure, he also is really kind of standing for openness and imagination against any kind of conformity or oppression, I would say, because he was really kind of hounded, even imprisoned in his time for his work, which was against, the socialist realism of the time, but also as a queer filmmaker and as kind of someone who was seen to have nationalistic tendencies, supporting the smaller cultures of the region against this kind of large Soviet monolith, which was kind of essentially like a Russifying force, I would say. So he's really amazing. And also personally, he was the first filmmaker I ever encountered that introduced me to Georgian cinema, I would say, which I later became very much into. So where I grew up in little New Zealand, we had a local DVD store, and you could rent The Color of Pomegranates and The Legend of Suram Fortress. I think those were the only probably films dealing with the Caucasus you could probably find there. So I watched those when I was a teenager, and I was really kind of amazed by them.
Was this DVD store in rural New Zealand that had The Legend of Suram Fortress in it?
Yeah, it was in the city of Dunedin, where I went to university, and it had a few art house shelves, so that those ones you could find. I think probably they had a few, I don't know, artificial eye titles or something, but those ones were there anyway. So I didn't know anything about the context, but it was just kind of, something quite surreal and amazing to come across, which, because they're quite unique. So
a bit of a serendipity for young Carmen. I think
yeah,
what you're saying about his position in the Soviet kind of filmmaking system in the kind of 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's interesting. I think he kind of confirms some stereotypes about Soviet cinema and also kind of confounds them at the same time. Because like you say, he was an outlier. He's got a very kind of unique poetic point of view. But he does also stand for certain trends within Soviet cinema at the time. The 70s, that kind of Brezhnev era, the cliched idea of it is this kind of gray, monolithic, sinking into stagnation, late socialist apathy and all that. But it is also the time when you start to see the emergence of this Soviet art house, the likes of Tarkovsky, maybe German, Panfilov, and Georgian directors in particular. I mean, you've already mentioned Georgian cinema, people like Yosseliani and Abeladze. And then Parajanov is this kind of totemic figure for this often, as you say, hounded, but definitely present and kind of emerging strand of this individually minded, artistically minded type of Soviet filmmaking. So he's an outlier who's also kind of on trend. He's a peculiar figure.
Yeah, I mean, he's friends with Tarkovsky, and Ivan's childhood, I think, actually inspired him to kind of break away from this whole socialist, realist tradition, because he studied in Moscow and he started making films which were more in line with state dictates. And then he saw Ivan's childhood and the fact that it has this kind of dreamlike elements. I think he was then more inspired to go in that direction. I mean, but Tarkovsky was also kind of working within the state, but definitely I would say not exactly pro-government, so I think all those filmmakers were kind of inspiring each other, and even in practical terms, supporting each other. So when Parajanov was imprisoned, I mean, Tarkovsky and other figures were quite heavily petitioning for his release. So he is definitely, part of a wider kind of group of, experimenters, I would say.
And that question of folk culture and national folk cultures of the individual kind of states or regions that were encompassed by the Soviet Union is also kind of paradoxical one, because the Soviet Union, it varied over time, but as a rule, there was this idea that kind of expressions of quote unquote national culture, folkish, folkloric expressions of national culture were fine as long as they were formulaic in the sense of not diverting from a kind of diverging from an ideological message at heart. So it's not actually that unusual that someone would make films based on, say, the folklore of Armenia or Georgia or Ukraine. But what's unusual is the extent to which Parajanov just immerses himself entirely in those folk worlds and leaves the ideological stuff behind. And that's when he starts to get in a little trouble. That's where he starts to kind of push the envelope. And that's also what makes his film stand out and makes him this unique figure in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I would say he was quite political as well. Like, he had kind of expressed some kind of solidarity with Ukrainian nationalism as a movement, for example, as well, which also, I think, like a combination of things kind of put the authorities on edge a little bit. So when he started veering off down that path, so he studied in Moscow, then he moved to Ukraine, and he was making films there. So at first it was kind of supported by the system, but then he kind of got completely banned. And I think it was, the stylistic things, but also the combination of, him being like a queer filmmaker, which he was targeted for. And yeah, also I think these like folklore cultures, I think his like solidarity with nationalism, I think the state kind of started to see it as potentially a little bit too kind of like, stirring up of these kind of separatist sentiments. So yeah, he kind of became quite like repressed, we can say.
I mean, I guess it's important maybe just to provide a bit of context here. In the Soviet context, the word nationalism, it means a certain thing. So from the point of view of the Soviet authorities, nationalism is this term used to refer to this kind of supposedly noxious separatist sentiment that might be kind of bubbling under the surface in the various republics that make up the Soviet Union. And it's a crime, basically. It's a pejorative term, and that's why these expressions of national cultures, folk cultures, and so on, are always walking this tightrope between kind of ideological probity and getting too deep into the reeds of the kind of specifics of these individual cultures, which then becomes this kind of capital N criminal nationalism that has to be cracked down on. I think let's break down his career a little bit then for people who might not be super familiar with him. So, to my mind, his career breaks down into a couple of stages. Unfortunately for him, several of those stages are at prison. So he studies in Moscow. He moves to Ukraine. So there's this Ukrainian period where at first, like you say, he's making studio-friendly films that he later disowns as trash. Mm-hmm. And then he sees Tarkovsky's film Ivan's Childhood in the early 60s, and it blows his mind, opens his third eye. And then he makes Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, 1965. Mm-hmm. This is his first mature masterpiece. And it's this exploration of Hutzul culture, this sub-ethnic group in the Carpathian Mountains in Western Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Then he goes back to the Caucasus, and with several interruptions for him being in prison, he makes this kind of trilogy of features over the 70s and 80s, which are about the different folk traditions and cultures of the three Caucasian countries, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And in between, there are a bunch of shorts and abortive projects and so on. But that's the kind of the overall shape of his career. Where should we start? Did you want to tell us maybe a little bit more about Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors? Because that's the first, that's Parajanov proper. That's his kind of coming of age moment, cinematically speaking.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically about a blood feud, I would say. As you said, like these Hutzul lovers. I think it's based on a novel by
Kostavinsky.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so with that, more of a kind of a surreal folk fable that I think he's moving away from socialist realism now. Yeah, and it also has elements of, like his estranged wife gets involved in magic. So this kind of like, the incorporation of, the occult and magic and things like that, which were quite important through that kind of trilogy, which I think was not exactly that popular with, the communist state.
Yeah, it's kind of like a mountainous Ukrainian Romeo and Juliet, but told with this unbelievably vibrant palette that really incorporates the kind of textures and colors of Hutzul folk culture, but also the camera is so alive. It's all over the place. It's kind of running up and down trees and swooping through villages. It kind of comes out of nowhere. If you've seen his films from beforehand, they're fine. They're pretty generic. And then all of a sudden, it's like this explosion of creativity. And then, so after he's made this film, and it was not a kind of repressed film. It was released. There was a Russian dubbed version, maybe, you know, it was filmed in the Hutzul dialect of Ukrainian. It was released in that dialect. It was released quite widely in the Soviet Union. So at this time, in the 60s, there's not quite this sense of a total crackdown. And then at the end of the 60s, he goes to Armenia, where he was ethnic Armenian, born and raised in Georgia, but his parents were Armenian. He goes back to the homeland, as it were, to work on Sayat Nova, or The Color of Pomegranates, as it's best known in English, which is another kind of step even further into the beyond, artistically speaking. I mean, if you had to describe the look and sound of The Color of Pomegranates to a newcomer, what would you say?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, this is based on like an 18th century Armenian poet and lute player, Sayat Nova, but it's not in any sense a conventional biography, I think we can safely say. So it's kind of these amazing like tableau, kind of like moving or active tableau of like dreamlike images, esoteric objects, you know, like skulls or peacocks or candles, which kind of create a sense like he intended to show the more like the inner world of this poet rather than any kind of like narrative, which is also what the state didn't like, because, you know, socialist realism was all about easy to understand narratives and stories which could give you a kind of a moral, and this was nothing like that. And yeah, so very imagistic, very kind of dreamlike, also with, you know, with this whole kind of folkloric focus on, you know, the homeland. So, you know, things like a pomegranate that's been cut and it's kind of bleeding juice in the form of Armenia, like ancient Armenia. But yeah, I mean, just very surreal. I would say with these films as well, you know, there's a real focus on like martyrdom as well, and resistance, like with this whole the three films of that trilogy in the Caucasus. Yeah, so kind of honor ancient tradition, these kind of things, which none of this really sat very well with you know, the kind of Soviet conception of this very large and supposedly inclusive but quite like monolithic state, I would say.
Yeah, there's that great Martin Scorsese quote about Color of Pomegranates, which I'm now going to fail to remember accurately. He says, when I started watching it, I didn't know anything about Sayat Nova, and when I finished, I didn't either. But Parajanov had kind of opened the door to a whole new realm of cinematic possibility. It's this kind of what's the word? It's synesthetic approach where he attempts to kind of, through film, to convey the sensation of a variety of different art forms. Yeah. So that's why, as you say, he shoots in these kind of vibrant, vivid tableau that recall kind of ancient religious manuscripts or kind of landscape paintings. There's this incorporation of this traditional music as well. There's very few words, given that it's a film about a poet, a bard, but it's nonetheless this sense that he has, and I think speaks to his life as an artist. I mean, I know you and I have both been to his museum, his house museum in Yerevan. Mm-hmm. This guy was a kind of constantly overflowing artistic fount. I mean, he was constantly making different artworks, collages, sewing, painting, photography, film. So his films from this point on don't really kind of stick to film, as it were. They're these expansive attempts to kind of, as you say, create a sense of the inner world of this this guy through the incorporation of all these different art forms.
Yeah.
And like you say, this is also a point where he starts getting in trouble. So it's, I think, a couple of years later, 1973, he's arrested for a number of different charges, including, I think, kind of trading in illegal antique furniture, but mainly for basically homosexual sexual assault. And he ends up in
I
prison.
think he was officially accused of like Ukrainian nationalism, homosexuality, propagation of pornography. I think, and he did like a raft of charges, which, I mean, it's arguable, but like pretty clearly politically trumped up charges. And then served like 4 years in a labor camp, 4 of a 5-year sentence. And it's true, as you say, he was like, even in prison, he was making things like kind of, I think, from just anything he could get his hands on, like coins from bottle tops. And so so he kind of had to create, and he just used anything that was around him.
Yeah, it's very moving when you, again, just to refer back to the his house museum collects a lot of these items. He was literally kind of smuggling into his cell a matchbox and then turning it into a tiny decorated playing card. Things like this, like very kind of moving assertions of creativity in really bleak circumstances. But yeah, like you say, he is eventually released, but then he's still basically not allowed to work until the mid-80s. So he kind of retires to Tbilisi and Yerevan and kind of works on his kind of artistic passions and pursuits. But then eventually in the 80s, he is allowed to return to feature filmmaking, and he makes these 2 more Caucasian films, The Legend of Suram Fortress in 1985, which is a kind of exploration of Georgian folklore. And then in 1988, his last feature, Ashik Karib, which is an exploration of Azerbaijani culture and folklore. So then by the end of his life, he has made this kind of trilogy of Caucasian films. Is there, to your eyes, is there a difference between those later 2 films and Color of Pomegranates? Can we see maybe the effect of the intervening prison and pariah years?
I think the remarkable thing about The Legend of Suram Fortress, like, is that it's remarkably similar. I mean, like, he has this kind of very unique signature, which was just as strong, and it's a similar style and also story of martyrdom again. So this one, you have, like a serf that's been freed by his master, and his son bricks himself up alive in the wall of this fortress, to, like, this fortune teller has said this is the only way to stop the fortress crumbling as Georgia comes under invasion. So these Islamic incursions. So yeah, again, a story about like defending your homeland. And I think it's quite similar in ethos and like kind of visual extravagant invention as well, I would say. So I think, imprisonment didn't like quash his desire to experiment. If anything, it probably made him bolder, I would say.
So you've mentioned this term of national identity, national culture, and also this idea that recurs in his films of martyrdom for the homeland, or this idea of protecting a homeland. And I think it's that aspect of his films which maybe helps us to frame Parajanov today for the kind of the modern audience in the modern world, because this question of national identity in these post-Soviet states is obviously extremely complex and vexed and important. For a number of the countries that we've been talking about, Ukraine, Armenia, identity that is militarily under threat.
Yeah.
But at the same time,
militarily, but also culturally as well, I would say. I mean, especially now in Georgia, as we speak, there are people out protesting on the street. I mean, against a government that has suddenly veered towards becoming more Russia-leaning and authoritarian in the last couple of years, and has just introduced a big package of censorship laws as well. So I think, I mean, 100 years on, it's quite notable that history goes in circles and we're kind of back to the same place. So now in Georgia, there's like 450 plus industry professionals in total boycott of the film center because of censorship. So again, and they're really concerned about this question of preserving, you know, free expression and Georgian culture against the threat of like Russia or cultural imperialism as they see it. So I feel like it's kind of the same kind of thing happening all over again.
And if people, I will just, a quick opportunity for self-promotion. There's an interview with some members of that so-called film movement in Georgia in the first season of the Klassiki Podcast. So if you scroll back in your podcast app, you'll be able to find out more about what Carmen's just described. So, I mean, yes, like you say, these questions of these territorial and these cultural social questions are vexed, are prominent now. But what's so interesting about Parajanov is that he never allows us to fall back on a kind of easy, comfortable myth of a kind of unitary national identity. He is a trans-national filmmaker. He's a trans-Caucasian filmmaker. He's an Armenian who was raised in Georgia and who went to Ukraine and made one of the most important films in Ukrainian national film history. And all of his films draw on a kind of trans-Caucasian kind of transit of cultures and ideas and art forms and so on. So he does speak to the importance of maintaining a sense of cultural identity, but at the same time, he's a transnational filmmaker, and he speaks to the kind of.
I mean, he isn't. I would say, like, I mean, you have to remember that somewhere like Georgia, there's like a few million people only, you know, and I that whole sense of cohesion and preserving like a culture against a much larger kind of force. I think like while he was working in these different places and, you know, born in Georgia, but to Armenian parents, I think he would also say, you know, that kind of cohesion within a tiny culture is important. So I wouldn't really see him so much as a transnational filmmaker, even though he was working in different places.
This puts me in mind of something that the writer and curator Dan Bird told us when he was on the podcast last season. Dan's someone who's worked with Parajanov's materials for a long time. I believe if you live in Brighton, you can currently go and see his wonderful exhibition, which is based on the outtakes from The Color of Pomegranates. And Dan was talking about Parajanov, and he cited this line that Parajanov used towards the end of his life, looking back on these films from these various cultures that he'd made, where Parajanov said that he himself had, in retrospect, had something of a colonial approach to these various different cultures that he'd worked in. I guess maybe speaking to his sense that he had been engaged in a kind of process of what we'd now call cultural appropriation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's that thing of you're always walking a fine line, you know, between like appreciation and appropriation. But I would say with Parajanov, he's kind of an insider. I think he himself said, you know, I'm an Armenian born in Tbilisi, incarcerated in a Russian prison for being a Ukrainian nationalist. So I mean, he was kind of involved closely with all of these cultures, and even in Ukraine, had was working for the film studio there, had studied under Ukrainian directors.
Well, I guess the tell is that he is respected and celebrated in these various countries. So they clearly didn't mind his contributions to their film histories.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of solidarity there too, in terms of, this thing of Russian imperialism and safeguarding your own culture. I think there's a lot of commonality between those cultures that and solidarity that he is kind of a part of. So,
and I guess one final thing, if we're thinking about his relevance or his importance today, one thing I think is very important is something you've touched on already, this question of gender or sexuality. Last week on the podcast, we were talking about Eisenstein and how when we watch his films now, they have this very kind of contemporary, surprising, almost kind of radical take on gender and sexuality that suddenly seems very timely today. And I think it's the same with Parajanov as well. They speak to this fluidity and performative nature with these questions of gender and sexuality, which I think is really important to hold to, especially, as you say, at a time when kind of homophobic or regressive social attitudes are being deployed again in the very countries that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at a film like The Color of Pomegranates, there's a real, there's some scenes that are quite homoerotic. There's also a lot of gender fluidity within that film, and fluidity in general, I would say. So the actress Sofiko Chiarelli, who's in it, she's playing 5 parts, some male and some female. So it's very fluid in that sense, and even fluidity of interpretation, I would say too. So this Soviet idea that you need a clear narrative that's very easy to understand, this is completely not the case here, and it's very open to interpretation, and that also, I would say, is quite fluid as well. And yeah, I mean, unfortunately, so history repeats, and we're back to this phase now of Russia kind of stirring up division with this so-called laws against so-called gay propaganda, which now are being replicated in the Caucasus. So Georgia, the government has just brought in, this package of laws on family values and the protection of minors, it's called, but it's also basically just, a censorship of, queer identity in cinema, and that's looking to be quite repressive. So yeah, as a figure, I think Parajanov, as someone who really kind of resisted oppression at the time, he is now really relevant again as a kind of figure, who now today filmmakers are facing the same kind of censure of their work and even of themselves in society. So in that sense, I think he's a really important person for them.
Yeah, I think that word that's come up a number of times, fluidity, is the really key one, because as we've said, there's a fluidity for him between cultures. There's a fluidity in terms of things like gender, sexuality. There's a fluidity between different art forms where he incorporates different art forms within his films. And I think this question of, it's obviously important to kind of resist the imposition of foreign values or political kind of pressures from without, and it's also important to make sure that your own sense of national identity is based on openness and inclusivity, because I mean, obviously Russia is involved in what's going on in Georgia, but also there are strains within Georgian society that are very long standing, which are also kind of regressive or homophobic, and it's important to resist from both without and within. And Parajanov stands for both of those directions, as it were.
Yeah, I would say that he's based on, when we talk about him preserving national identity, I would say that's based on protection rather than judgment of others. Right. It's more when you have a very small country and few people to kind of uphold that. You're not the oppressor, these are the people whose culture is threatened. So he's really, I think he's wanting to protect those strands, but he also is, supporting like a diversity, of identity within that and within like the wider sphere. So protecting the little pockets of like authentic identity. So yeah, he's like an open protector, I would call him, I guess. Yeah.
Maybe that's a good point to leave it, because I'm sure that you and I could keep talking about Parajanov for hours, but it's much better for people to go and watch and enjoy his films than sit here and listen to us any longer. But Carmen Gray, thanks so much for stopping in to talk Parajanov centenary and to be part of this celebration, this ongoing celebration of all things Parajanov.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.